It's technically morning, so good morning, everyone. How's your I guess your extended weekend break?
Good.
That was
an extra day.
Extra, yeah. I'm again, you'll hear me talk about Wednesdays. I'm a big advocate for the idea of just like Monday, Tuesday, break, Wednesday, Thursday, like 4-day work week, but have that middle weekend Wednesday. And I thought it was profound, but there's actually a YouTube clip where somebody actually talks about the weekend Wednesday philosophy. And yeah, that would be my best of all possible worlds. But we'll take what we can get. We'll just have the weird ancillary holidays that pop up every now and then. And you guys will have to tolerate me on Wednesdays, but it's the best thing I can tell you about. All right, so a couple things I wanted to make sure that we're clear on before we get started. So first of all, for those of you who have completed the quiz, and I believe I believe it's everyone, but if you completed the quiz, thank you very much. That's the substantive interaction. If you have not done it yet, I'm going to be checking to make sure, just to make sure everybody's enrolled in the class has filled out the quiz. So this is kind of your last call. I do have to submit my substantive interaction paperwork by end of day today, so I don't want to say, oh, they didn't respond to my call. But again, I think everybody's in the class is submitted. So if you've not, do it like now. Yeah, I should probably do stuff in class when it's not classwork, but I want to make sure that gets done. And then something came up. I had a question from a student. I do want to provide a little bit of clarification on this. So in the syllabus, with respect to the homework, all you really need to do is answer the questions. For multiple choice questions, that involves circling the answer. And then for short answer questions, provide significant representative support for your answer. I do encourage you to do what you see fit to make sure that you understand the answers and details. I don't require documentation of support for answers in the multiple choice and not too significant beyond the short answer questions. But keep in mind, this is preparation for the exam that you're going to be doing here on the homework. So if you're just circling answers and not providing any context for your answers and don't understand that, you may not remember why it was that you answered a particular question when you come back to review it. So if you feel that you need to provide your own notes, that's great. That's not required for your submission, but I would encourage you to do so. I will strongly encourage you when we get to the review of the homework. We're going to do that first. Our first homework assignment is due on Friday. We're going to have our first homework review on Friday. As I'm going through the answers and I'm giving you information, take notes on that. That is very likely to come up during the exam. So as we're going through and I say, here's something you should consider with respect to this question, or here's something you should consider with respect to this topic, take detailed notes on that. The whole purpose of having an exam or homework review in class is so that I can give you representative remarks on what you need to know for the exam. And it's something I do in all my classes. So please take that seriously and diligently. I know it's not going to be fun, particularly this coming Friday, because it's Friday, you're ready for the weekend, but it is an important part of the process. Just a reminder, this will be one of the rare times that we'll be doing homework we'll do homework due on a Friday. Starting next week, homework will be due immediately on a Wednesday after we do it, our discussion on Monday. So we'll do chapter 3 on Monday, homework on Wednesday. Also, one last thing, put the effort into it that you think that I would be looking for and not necessarily what you want to do. I know that sucks. Okay, you're just kind of like, all right, this is so boring. We're going to do UML diagrams on Monday, and it's going to be like tedious. And I've already started that. By the way, you hear me say UML diagrams. If you're not familiar with them, they are by far the most miserable part of this entire course. All right. Are they important? Absolutely. They're really, really important for understanding structure of the diagram. That being said, if I could eliminate any part of this course and be satisfied that it was still representative, I would eliminate UML diagrams because students hate them, all right? You are going to do some UML diagrams next week, and you're going to be kind of like, I hope we don't have to go through this misery. And again, and the answer is yes, you're going to have to go through this misery, but multiple times. So the sooner you acclimate yourself, the better. I don't want to encourage you to do things you don't want to do, but it is important for the learning process to get acclimated to that. By far, the weakest part of any exam that I administer is when I start doing the UML diagrams and say, tell me what this UML diagram represents. If it's anything in this course, if it's something that you feel that you've got a good body of knowledge about, if you feel like you understand it really, really well, then that's all I'm asking for. If you kind of put a half effort into the homework and just say, all right, I'm just going to put a diagram on here that I think Dr. Bach can help you with, I'm not doing it, or we're not doing the homework for me, okay? I already understand the stuff. I've been teaching it for several years. It's mostly that you understand the stuff and you put it in context for later parts of this course. So again, that is ultimately what I'm asking for. And I will be reviewing the homework in my GTRA. And if I think that you're kind of phoning it in, then I will come back and talk to you and I'll say, look, I know this is not necessarily the most fun stuff, but it is really important to understand for this context moving forward. So keep that in mind moving forward. Again, this first part of the semester, especially when we start talking about the UML diagrams, now we actually create structure and activity diagram flows. That's not really fun, but you will see them in the real world, so you do need to be able to how to interpret them. So that's why we do that in this course. It'll be a lot more fun when we get to the later part of the semester. We start talking about cybersecurity. We start talking about artificial intelligence and internal controls. Maybe not that, but we start talking about stuff like that. It'll be a lot more interesting. All right. Let's go ahead and get into chapter 2. So we're going to start talking about diagrams in chapter 2 today. We're going to talk about accountants as business analysts. And oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I just have a question about the homework. Do we turn it in on Brightspace and in person?
Turn it on Brightspace and then bring it with you to class so that we can review it on Friday. But yeah, all the assignments will be turned in on Brightspace. Okay. All right, so we're going to be talking about diagrams today, but we do need to kind of clarify why it is that we're going to go through all this trouble of documenting information from an accounting system as it relates to business. And the diagram here, I'm not going to test you this table right here. So you can make a note of this right now, and you're like, this is something he's not going to test us about. This is for clarification purposes. Keep in mind that when we talk about accounting roles in a business, they are more than just preparing financial statements. There's a lot of things that relate to it. And that's one of the reasons that accounting is called the language of business, is simply because it pervades every single area of business that is relevant. For those of you who are marketing and management majors, you do have to have a good understanding of the accounting information that's prepared within the system, so you can actually make relevant decisions to moving forward. The numeric and agility that's required for finance is also something that's represented by accounting. They use the same body of information, same body of data. Even international business, understanding what the rules are within other domiciles and other areas of the world are really, really important. It's something that you're going to hear me say a lot of times. I realize that not everybody in this room is going to be an accounting major, and that's cool. Okay, diversity is really important in that regard, but it's really important to understand that this is the basis that we're going to be using for interpretation of information, because accounting is that language. So we talk about what it is that accounting does. It goes way beyond just the financial statement preparation. And some of this we can actually attribute to financial statement details. We can talk about how investor relations and raising capital loans relate to financial statements. Those are the means by which we relate to the investors. Financial statement preparation is a mechanism by which we report information to investors, and we actually make sure that they're satisfied with the performance of the organization. And then when we want to actually raise capital, we want to, whether that be equity or whether that be through debt, we need to actually have some basis to report to people saying we're a worthwhile entity to be able to invest in. This is something you should consider as part of your prospect. So all of this goes back to that idea, but accounting goes well beyond that. So there's regulatory compliance, which are those rules the government sets for an industry that we have to follow. There's the one thing I don't like talking about because I don't like paying them. That's taxes. Okay, I would be a much wealthier person if I didn't have to pay taxes. But then again, I probably wouldn't have the same level of benefits if I didn't have to pay taxes. So you're going to hear me joke about taxes a lot. I do think they're a necessary aspect, but sometimes I think everybody is just kind of frustrated by taxes. And occasionally, everybody's going to be there. I even, believe it or not, at one point I saw Dr. Caden get frustrated by taxes one time. Okay, it happened once. It was amazing. Yeah. And then basically statutory reporting. This is going to be for stakeholders outside of the organization. Keep in mind, when I use the term stakeholders, I'm not referring specifically to the shareholders anymore. I'm talking about anybody who has an interest in the organization. That kind of reporting is really important too, depending on the aspect that we're referring to. So what is it that we need to understand from respect to the accounting information system? Well, we're going to start talking about the documentation here in just a little bit and what form that takes place. But let's go ahead and get into the hierarchy and get to where we're trying to get to the point we're trying to reach, so we understand what it is we're developing. So first of all, we're going to talk about business processes, and this is defined as a sequence of business activities that use resources to achieve business goals. I've already alluded to this one time in this course. This was back in chapter 1. I said that we're going to talk about 3 main business process areas in this course. We're going to talk about revenues, we're going to talk about purchasing, and then we're going to talk about inventory. And the reason inventory is related to this is that it kind of falls in the middle. It relates to both revenue and purchasing. It actually makes for a very easy transition. There are definitely multiple other process areas we could allude back to, but those kind of relate to all of the process areas within a business, and so those are our primary areas. Then we use business analysis to define business process requirements and evaluate potential improvements. This is something that we're going to focus on very heavily in this course, is understanding why we do things in a certain process area and what areas can we improve upon? What areas do we need to address risk? What areas do we need to address just overall operational improvement? Then business models are going to be simple abstract representation of one or more business processes. Then we're getting into understanding of how we can actually characterize these things through images and through words. And then finally, using documentation to explain how business processes and systems operate. So that's kind of the payoff right here, because now we're going to be talking about what form documentation is going to take. Now, something we're going to note really, really quickly is we're going to have two different ways that we characterize documentation. The first of these is going to be activity models, and the second of these is going to be structure models. So there's going to be our two major types of business process models. And today we're going to talk about activity models and what forms those can take. And structure models are going to be more from chapter 3. Now, just as a quick clarification is the difference between these two concepts. When we talk about an activity model, this is more about how a human person would view a system. It kind of represents a logical flow of steps and how we would actually look at this if we were just talking about if we need to characterize a system to another human being, how we would describe that. Now, we can talk about this in terms of narrative depiction, but a lot of people tend to think in terms of visual cues, which is why we have things like flowcharts. Now, you may be saying, Dr. Barnes, are you going to make us learn flowcharts? And the answer is no, we're not going to learn flowcharts. We're going to talk about them, but we're not going to go into detail on flowcharts. We're actually going to take a step beyond that and go to a more modern system, which interestingly enough is a little bit more abstract and complex at the same time. So we'll talk about what that means shortly. In chapter 3, when we get to structure models, this is going to be more about system representations of data flows, about how we would characterize the flow of information through a computerized system, an information system. So there is going to be a little bit of a difference. The bad news or the good news, depending on how you look at it, is that you're going to be responsible for actually being able to characterize a business process in both contexts. You're going to have to know how to characterize it through an activity model and through a structure model, mostly because you're going to be operating both with human beings and with information systems in the real world. So being able to understand how to convey that information is going to be very important. But before we get there, let's go ahead and do a little bit of legwork, all right? What are some of the functions that are some of the purposes that documentation serves? So there's 4 of these that are really, really important to diagram. Some of these are more important than others. Some of these are fairly intuitive. Like this one is a fairly intuitive one. The first one we're going to talk about is promoting organizational efficiency, optimizing service and production with minimal inputs. If you understand how a system operates, then you can identify the point of the system that you need to interact, okay? Now, let's just say that I had no syllabus for this class. I had no diagram for how we're going to approach the class. You come in and you just sit down in your chair. You're going to not have any idea of what to expect or what you need to do on a day-to-day basis. And I'm going to say on one random day, pull out your homework. And you say, Dr. Barnes, you didn't assign me homework. And it's like, well, that was your responsibility to know. But I guess, well, you have no information for us to be able to make that determination. That would be really, really awkward, wouldn't it? All right. If I had no documentation of how this course worked. That would also mean that in the semester, when I handle those evaluations, it'd be a lot of line of zeros at the end, okay? Actually, I don't think 0 is a possible score. It'd just be a lot of 1s, but I'd be consistent on 1s. There's no documentation of the way the course is supposed to work, okay? So there's a purpose to my providing documentation. As onerous as that syllabus is to go through and to read through, it really serves a purpose. And the goal is that we want to be efficient. You want to know what it is that you're going to be doing on every single day. So you'll know for Friday, there's a homework assignment. I've got to do homework before Friday. You've got that guide set up before you. Related to that, we also want to perform organizational effectiveness. We want to obtain expected service and production outputs. So in addition to being efficient, you want to be effective. You want to actually accomplish the tasks that are necessary for success. And having those guidelines, having that documentation is going to make you more effective. So think about it again. If I said your homework's due on Friday, but I don't tell you what the homework assignment is, probably going to be very hard to be effective in that regard. It's like, oh, well, it's probably chapters 1 and 2. Those are the 2 assignments. I guess I'll just do all the problems in the book. How many people would actually take that extreme approach? Just say, well, Dr. Barnes didn't assign any homework, so I'm just going to do everything. If you're in that, I mean, I guess kudos, but that seems like a really extreme solution. More likely is you would look at it and you would say, I'm just not going to do any of it because he didn't. And that would be a rational approach. The problem is it probably wouldn't be a very effective approach. So having this guidelines, having this documentation down and understanding what it is that you need to do is going to make us both more efficient and more effective in our roles. Now, that is kind of easy to allude to with respect to this particular course, but let's talk about some business specific concerns. We also want to make sure that there's proper design and operation of internal controls. Now, just as a reminder, last week I defined controls and I gave you a very simple definition. Does anybody remember what the definition was? Controls are a response to a risk. Okay, a control is a response to a risk. That's all you really need to know for right now. With respect to any organization, by virtue of going into business, you are going to be exposing yourself to certain risks in a business. And in order to be able to respond effectively to those risks, you need to implement the proper controls, the proper responses to those. An information system will help you do that because the information system will help you identify what risks are present and then necessarily respond. Now, the very neat thing about controls that we're starting to identify, we're going to see this when we start working through NetSuite next week, is that we can actually categorize controls in multiple different ways. One very easy way to categorize control is whether it's an automated control or a manual control. You can think of an automated control as something the system does for you, which is great. If you've got something the system does for you, you can rely upon, that gives you a lot more assurance that things are being accomplished properly. But sometimes we have to do the manual work ourselves. So good example of an automated control is what you guys do every single time you come into this classroom and you want to work on the computer in here. What's the very first thing you have to do? Log in. You know, provide some credentials, excuse me. And provide some credentials so that you can actually sign into the computer and you can actually log in and be able to utilize the system. And that's what something Truman has implemented. They don't want random people coming in and starting to use the computer and utilizing tools that they haven't paid for or not authorized to use. More appropriately, they don't want people to be able to access any accounts. It would be really, really awkward if you sat down and somebody else's account popped up. I don't know. Awkward for them may be an opportunity for you. Who knows? Who knows? But I wouldn't encourage that type of behavior. But anyway. So that's why we have good controls, and that's an example of automated control. Manual control would be more about looking at any exceptions that came up and trying to review and see the source of those exceptions. We'll look at far more examples of those, but keep in mind, internal controls is one of my favorite things to talk about in every single course that I teach. It is really, really important to understand the nature of controls. Right now, all you're responsible for is understanding that risks exist. These are the responses to those risks. Then finally, compliance with relevant laws and regulations. So any industry or any business that operates, they're going to have to operate within a certain set of guidelines. If they fail to do that, usually that's characterized as fraud, okay, or fraudulent behavior. We're not going to promote fraudulent behavior in any organization, so we need to make sure that they understand that if there are rules you're supposed to follow, if there's laws you need to follow, what are those rules and what is the best way to follow those? Again, these are going to vary from industry to industry. Different industries are going to have different requirements they have to follow. For the most part, we're going to keep this at a very general level. Some of these rules are pretty straightforward, like don't steal from your employer, things along those lines. This is going to relate back to those controls that we talked about, but this takes a much larger aspect because we also need to kind of think about ethical considerations and how we promote those within an organization. The information system will help us do that, and documentation will help us promote that within the system itself. All right, some additional roles of documentation facilitates. Employee training, as we're going to find out, it's really, really pointless to have a good information system if nobody knows what they're doing. So training is really important. I say this as somebody who's really, really bad about training. Whenever I went to training when I was in public accounting or any job that I ever worked, even in Truman, I'm really, really bad about it. They go through these training protocols and I'll just kind of sit there and I'll just zone out and it's like, what am I going to do this weekend? Actually, that's not true. I'm like, what am I going to have for lunch? That's more accurate, okay? That's where I'm at. I'm not very good with training, but I recognize the importance of it because if people don't understand what they're doing, they can't do an effective job. I tend to be one of those hands-on learners. If you show me how to do something and you actually show me what to do, then I pick up on it pretty quickly. But, you know, it's different strokes for different folks, I guess. Audit requirements, okay? As we note, there's going to be external oversight over the work that we do. So we need to understand what is the documentation, what is the work that we have to do to provide it for audit. This can be both internal, so internal audit and external audit. External audit tends to be more formal and more official. Internal audit tends to be more about trying to find the guidelines within the organization itself. Regardless, it's going to be important in any scenario. I don't know how you feel about auditors. Some people have very extreme feelings, okay? Some tax professors said never trust an auditor, okay? But anyway, yeah, that's going to be really important as well. Accountability, this is obviously really important to understand because you're going to be accountable for what it is that you do within an organization, and there needs to be tracking of that. If you make a mistake, that's fine, but they need to understand what the source of the mistake was and try to correct it. And probably more importantly, if you're committing a fraud, they probably want to be able to know that. Again, don't commit fraud. That's just a good idea. Then external communications, that's kind of the accounting communications you learned back in Accounting 220, those financial reporting and disclosures that you learned then. And internal communications, that's what you learned in 221, how to actually operate on a day-to-day basis within the organization. All right, with that, let's talk about some documentation types. So process and system documentation, they generally consist of two complementary types. That's going to be narrative descriptions and then graphical representation. Now, narrative descriptions, just so they sound, narratives are going to actually use words, whereas graphical representation use shapes and forms. We're going to focus on the last, which is going to be business process models. Specifically, we're going to talk about BPMN, business process model notation. I'm going to introduce this to you in this course, or this class period. We're going to reflect upon this when we get to chapters, I believe it's chapters 5, 6, and 7. When we get to the business process section, we're actually going to apply our business process model notation learning to specific scenarios. So we're going to be introducing today, but we're going to talk about all of these to a lesser degree. I'm going to kind of go through them at a very fast pace just to make sure we cover everything. We're going to focus mostly on this last one, though, business process models. Now, the question is, why is documentation so critical? We've talked a lot about kind of the detailed intuition behind it, but let's think about this at a very general level, okay? So as technology has evolved, the nature of process and system documentation has changed at pace. Now, I want you to consider the following, all right? Is everybody familiar with this thing right here? Yeah, seeing that's like an iPad, okay? I've got an iPad that I know how to use, which is probably the best that can be said for it. I can point and click, which is really important. Has anybody seen one of these before? So this is an IBM PC. I think this was the 3160, but I could be getting those numbers wrong. This is actually from the late 1980s, all right? So this is the machine that your parents probably grew up on. They talk about diskettes, and you're like, what the heck's a diskette, okay? They didn't have hard drives. You actually had to take memory, or the memory storage was on these floppy disks, which you may have seen in like old movies and stuff like that, and put them in there. You can actually see the ports where they're included there. Hard drives didn't come until late 80s, early 90s. I remember when we got our first hard drive, my father was like, this is really cool. I got 40 whole megabytes of storage. 40 whole megabytes of storage. How are we going to ever use that much storage? He actually said those words, believe it or not. So yeah, if we go back even further, this is a Columbia punch card machine back from the late 1960s, all right? Now, just let's think about this at a very intuitive level, all right? From the perspective of use, which one of these would you rather use as a system user? So say I said, you have to do all of your assignments on one of these three machines moving forward, and you have to upload it to Brightspace. Which one would you like to use the most? Now, I know you're going to say, I would rather use a real computer, Dr. Barnes, okay? And I'm not giving you that option, but I get to do that because it's a hypothetical scenario, okay? So you get to use one of these three machines for your Brightspace assignments. Which one are you going to use? iPad. Probably the iPad, right? Probably the iPad. If you're like, I like a challenge, the Columbia punch card computer, it's like, good luck getting internet connectivity with that. That would be amazing, okay? Yeah, but use is going to be really easy for the iPad. It would still be a challenge, okay, because the iPad tools are not as intuitive as just sitting at a computer and be able to use like Microsoft suite of tools. But I think that we could say that even though it would probably take a little bit longer, the iPad would be the most efficient for this by a far margin. But let's think about this from a system administration standpoint. Let's say you're the system administrator and you're trying to provide documentation on how to manage the system itself, okay? How to manage the technology here. All right, so which one of these do you think would require the most documentation to administer to show how to use it, all the little nuances and quirks? Probably the iPad as well, right? There's a lot more that you can do for it. So basically, even though the ease of use is much easier for the iPad, there's also going to be a corresponding increase in the complexity of the system itself. That is what we've achieved as businesses and society, is that basically we've managed to make things easier to use, but much harder to operate and maintain over time. So that's kind of where we're at. That's why we have increasing systems of flowcharts and diagrams that these simple systems suffice really easily when we're using Columbia punch card computer systems, even these simple PC systems that network together. But as we start having network connectivity, as we start having unique issues like cybersecurity and cloud computing, we have to think about a lot more than just what one computer can do, about one system can do. So the first thing we're going to talk about is narrative description. Now, narrative descriptions will pretty much exist in every single context. And the reason why is pretty straightforward, because it's a written depiction of the components, flows, and processes within the system. Now, the good news is these can be very detailed. You can write as much information as you want about a particular system. The bad part is that as human beings, we have a hard time following that, particularly with really complex systems. Imagine you're trying to describe the flows of information within a cloud computing system, and you're trying to write this down how many paragraphs would that be? 100, 200? I don't know. It would probably be very, very detailed and very, very tedious to have to actually read through that. Probably be very detailed to try to prepare that. So we usually use narrative descriptions in unison with graphical representations because we tend to think in terms of more images. Now, I'm one of those people who actually prefers narrative descriptions because I'm very detail oriented, especially with this. That being said, even my mind can kind of get expanded too much by this. So it's really, really good that we actually use this in unison. And we're going to see that. You're going to see that on your assignments. You're going to see that on your exams. You're going to have narrative representations, and you're going to have to see how it aligns with the graphical representations we're going to be using. Now, just for context, I want to show you what block diagrams and data flow diagrams look like. We are not going to be doing those these in this course simply because they're very old and very outdated. So a block diagram is kind of the first graphical representation. As you can see, this is a very simple depiction of a system. We can talk about what's within a process, the sub-processes in there, and the items that flow there too. So basically, if we're talking about a depiction of the way the information flows through the system, this is a very basic representation of that. The problem with that is because it's so basic, it doesn't really give us any detail. So that's going to be kind of an antiquated system that we can no longer get any value out of. Moving forward, we're going to move past just one symbol. Then we're moving to what we're going to talk about is data flow diagram. Now, data flow diagram is a little bit more representative. It uses 4 different categories of symbols. So we've got a block entity symbol, we've got a process symbol, we've got a data store, and a data flow. And this is going to give us a little bit more of a leverage on how we can actually look at data that flows through the system. So as we can see here, this is a little bit more of a cash receipt system, which is a sub-process of the revenue system. We can see that we've got an entity here, and we've got a process that an entity engages in. Another entity is part of that process. So a customer is going to actually send cash to the bank, okay? Which makes sense because that's what we do. We've actually deposit cash to the bank. This tells us not only what the entities are and the processes are, but what the process flows are between each of these systems and where these areas go. Now, I think we can all agree that even though this is more complex than our block diagram, it does give us more information and more detail. It is a little bit awkward and clunky, okay? It is a little bit awkward and clunky as it doesn't really define the differences between the different types of entities in their very nature. But I will say that this is probably more manageable than what we were looking at before. Now, what you're probably familiar with, if you've heard this term before, has anybody heard the term flowcharts before? We tend to use that in common everyday vernacular as anything that details a process. You probably have created flowcharts, whether these be actually meet traditional flowchart standards or they're just informal flowcharts. You've probably done these before. Flowcharts are kind of the evolution of this. Now, a flowchart is a graphical representation. It's a highly detailed view of a system's component of processes. If I remember correctly, flowcharts came in prominence in the late 70s, early 80s. I don't remember the exact date. They're still used by some companies today because they are very, very detailed. They do provide a good depiction. They are a little bit outdated for advanced technology systems, but they can serve purposes if we're talking about lower technology environments. So it shows what a system does and how the system does it. These are going to be frequently used by accountants, but they can be used in a lot of different contexts. They follow what's called an if-then format. And the idea being is that if we do a certain step, what is going to be the result of that? So we need to actually say, what is the input, what comes the output? Because to show what the processes are, not as they should be, it is governed by national and international standards. Now, I'm going to show you some slides. This is more contextual than anything. You do need to have some basic idea of what flowcharts do, but I'm not going to make you memorize the flowchart notation. You're not going to have to memorize what the process flows are for different flowcharts. This is kind of an introduction to actually as we move into business process model notation. But let's take a look and see what some flowcharts look like. So here's our symbol and our terminology. Again, flowchart notation tends to be a little bit antiquated. Some of the notation you can kind of note is not even really applicable anymore, such as magnetic tape and storage. There are systems that don't actually use that magnetic storage anymore. A lot of the systems that probably we operate with use electronic storage. So that's going to be kind of an example of why flowcharts are a little bit antiquated to note. But we do delineate a lot of areas to processes and storage because these are going to be characteristics of how we identify information. Now, one thing I'm going to note, we're going to actually see this in a little bit, is flowcharts are generally characterized by what is happening within the system itself. And the way we characterize that usually falls within 4 steps. The first of those is going to be an input. Secondly, is going to be a processing step. Third of this is going to be a storage step. And the final one would be an output step. So I kind of shorten that as IPSO, and you don't need to worry about writing that down just now because we'll see it in a slide here shortly. But the idea being is that we understand what the nature of the step is. We can actually follow it from another area, and we can understand what the nature of the process is. So input and output we've already defined. That came from our lecture on last Wednesday, because we talked about Excel and AI on Friday. So we talked about that on Wednesday, the nature of input and output. What about processing? Processing is just basically where we take an input and transform it into an output. And then storage actually just accommodates timing differences. So all of these items that are in a flowchart are going to be represent one of those types of steps. So as you can see here, we've got a much detailed focused flowchart of the cash receipt systems. Now, personally speaking, I do prefer the data flow diagram representation, mostly because it's simple. Trying to absorb this and look at this and say what's going on here, it's actually not that hard if you take a few minutes to break it down. But just looking at this right now, you're just like, oh my gosh, that's way too much information, way too much to flow. And this is only one of the sub-process areas. This is just cash receipts. But let's go ahead and take a quick step and make sure we understand what is happening here from the perspective that I just did. So we actually can see here is that we've got a customer check, which would be an input in the cash receipt system. Makes sense, because customers send a check to pay for the system. What do we need to do with that check? Do we just hold on to it and just put it into a frame and say, look, more customer checks. We're going to use it as wallpaper. That would be kind of cool, but it would probably hurt the cash flows of the business. At some point, we need to process this check through the system so that it actually reaches the bank, and we actually convert that check into a cash flow for the organization. That's going to be one of the processes. Now, you will notice that we've actually got decisions here, okay? And this is actually says, do documents match? It's a little bit hard to read. The idea being is in this process, we need to know, was the customer check that was sent in, does it match the payment amount that the customer owes? So presumably they've got an invoice and they say, we're going to pay this amount on the invoice, or the customer check does not match that invoice. And we have to answer the question, why does the customer check not match the invoice? But this is an example of one of those processes that I've talked about. It's one of those processes where we actually have to answer a question. A little bit later on, we'll notice that when we get to the customer check, we have that. We store this in a cash receipts transaction file. Now, the reason that we talk about storage is one of those important steps and it gets very, very frequently misunderstood. Why do we have a storage step? The answer is because there's not always going to be an alignment between the time and timing of transactions. So an example of this is, think about if you're creating a financial statement. You're accumulating all the transactions that occurred over a period of time. So can you take those transactions and immediately throw them into a financial statement? The answer is no. You create transactions at some point in time in the future, but you need all the transactions to be aggregated to do that. So you have to actually have a storage mechanism to store all those transactions. Now, the nature of the transaction is defined by the storage mechanism. In this case, we're talking about a cash receipts transaction. At some point, those cash receipts transactions will come out and they will aggregate into a report that will be useful for somebody who needs to report on that information. And then we have the storage, and then presumably that storage is going to be used for some mechanism, some document that's going to be created. That's going to be our output, right? Now, one other quick note. You will notice that there are arrows here that point in certain directions that dictate where direction is supposed to go. These are additional additional item called flows, which makes sense because it's called a flow chart. So it shows this flow of information throughout the system. So just a few notations. This diamond is actually going to be talking about decision symbol usage. That was one that we talked about before. If there's a question that needs to be answered, the decision symbols will actually determine what the nature of the question is. It does not always need to be a yes/no question, but it does need to have a limited number of possible defined responses. So if we're talking about yes, no, it's two directions. If we're talking about a series of when the payment is due, they're going to have to define what the date ranges are that we have to define. But regardless, that's what the decision symbols mean. We'll see something very similar to this in the process of model notation, which is why I bring this up now. As far as document symbol usage, this is something that's not as relevant, but I do want to bring it up because it is something that gets a lot confusing. We will see a lot of this when we get to NetSuite, not in flowcharts, but something that's very relevant to this concept. So you'll notice that we've got 6 copies of a sales order in a flowchart. 6 copies of a sales order. Why do we have 6 copies of a sales order? We only really need 1, right? Well, think about it from the perspective of the people who are using the system. This is not a physical copy of the sales order necessarily, but the sales order is going to be used by different departments within an organization, all right? One is going to go to the customer, one would go to shipping, some would go to inventory control, multiple ones go to accounts receivable. All of these parties need to have the sales order to be able to make proper decisions. In some scenarios, they're going to have to match the sales order to other documentation. So when you see a document like this, it's reflecting the fact that certain documents have to flow to different departments within the organization. Again, this is not going to be as formalized within our business process model notation, but it will be really important to note this when we get to the NetSuite analysis, because we need to know what documents need to be associated with what processes within the system. And then something I encourage, basically, if you ever see like these symbols right here, the circles with the letter in between, those are just saying that it's too big to fit in one page. Match this symbol to one page to a symbol in another page. And that actually will come up in some of our documentation. If you are interested in flowchart guidelines, I did provide them here. You don't need to memorize these. These are just mostly for reference. Again, it is entirely possible that you will encounter flowcharts in your day-to-day activities as you leave Truman State. You may encounter them at Truman State. They are a little bit dated. They are a little bit complex and convoluted in some cases, but for the most part, they are the standard that has been in place for going on 50 years now. So they do have some purpose. As I alluded to, when we talk about flowcharts, we talk about data processing in the flowcharts. There's 4 primary steps. These are the ones I already talked about. Data input, which is capture, processing, storage, and communication of information, which is the output. So IPSO, and then we have those flows, which are those arrows. And the flowcharting symbols loosely correspond to the parts of the data processing cycle that they relate to. I think this is probably the most valuable slide out of all of the slides on the flowchart, because you can interpret what happens in a flowchart without knowing the symbols, as long as you remember what is it the information is trying to do. Is it trying to convey an input, a processing step, a storage step, or an output step? Though it is kind of confusing, because sometimes the outputs of one area will represent inputs in another area. So you do have to keep in mind that it's not as simple as saying it's going to be just one or the other. So it can get a little bit complicated. All right, everybody well and truly exhausted? Unfortunately, we're not done. I got 11 minutes to teach a BPMN. Now, the good news about BPMN is that BPMN is a simplification in some respects of flowcharting. There are some complexities that we're going to have to look at, but for most part, these are intuitive complexities. I do vastly prefer BPMN to flowcharting. I think it's a lot more straightforward. And you're going to notice that it seems a lot more simple. There are a few things that we do have to clarify, though. So it stands for Business Process Model Notation. It was first adopted in 2004. So BPMN is about the age of most people in this room, okay? So there's contemporaries. It is maintained by the Object Management Group. And the only reason I mentioned this particular organization is this is the same organization that actually maintains the documentation standards for UML diagrams. So when you start hating UML diagrams next week, you can say, okay, Object Management Group, got it. They're responsible for both of my sources of misery. Okay, you can send hate mail there instead of sending it to my evaluations, okay? Yeah, so it represents an upgrade to traditional flowcharting to encompass more complex and more modern business processes and systems, which is funny because that doesn't sound like consistently what I just said. I said this is simpler in many regards. And the answer, the reason behind this is that it's a more abstract representation. The detailed representation kind of gives you an understanding of what happens at every single point in time. But we're talking about business process interpretation at a strategic level, at the management level. A manager probably doesn't want to know what are the documents that are flowing from different processes, how many copies do I need. They need to understand what information is conveyed to what part of the system and what entities are involved. So it's, again, more abstract, but it's going to be more complex in the regard that it can encompass more parts of the organization. In generally speaking, we are going to actually have some notation. You are going to have to create your own BPMN diagrams, probably handwritten. Some of you may get a little bit innovative and try to use certain tools. I actually can do them in Excel because it does have all the things you need in Excel. That being said, if you want to write them down and just take an image of that, that's fine too. That's absolutely allowed. But you can use specialized modeling software for more complex versions of this. I will say that all we're going to cover in this course are going to be very, very basic BPMN diagrams. We're not going to get too complex. We will look at more iterative versions, but come exam 1, when you have an expectation for what it is you need to reproduce, I will give you specific diagrams that say, this is the level I expect you to operate at. Anything beyond that is going to be something you should be able to interpret, but you don't need to reproduce those levels of diagrams. So the first thing we need to know with BPMN diagrams is they're defined by events, okay? Usually it's going to include start and ending events. Those are going to be present in every diagram. At least they should be present in every diagram. And in some scenarios, we're going to have intermediate events. Those are going to depict important points of decision making that we need to be aware of. Now, the reason I am a little bit pessimistic about this is that I do believe that whenever you have a decision branch, that there should always be an ending event, or there should be at least a merger of the gateway. BPMN diagrams in this book tend to be a little bit sporadic on their consistency and usage. And so you'll hear me complain about that. That being said, for the most part, it's a pretty simplistic interpretation of how to use BPMN diagrams. So this is the first thing we need to know. We see circles. The circles mean events. That's the easiest interpretation of this. If it's one circle, start. If it's a blackened circle, bold circle, that's an end. If it's a circle surrounded by a circle, that's an intermediate event. That's the easy interpretation. Then we have activities. These are specific steps in the business processes. Basic activities are modeled as rounded rectangles. And the good news is this is about as complex as it gets with respect to activities. We're not going to interpret activities based on the nature of activities any differently. Instead, we're going to use our narrative within the activity diagrams themselves to define the activities. So every time that we see an activity, it won't say the word activity. It will actually have a definition of what the activity is. It's described with a short verb phrase. So it's kind of nice because it's a combination of those narrative descriptions, but within a graphical diagram. And then finally, we're going to have our flows. Okay, there's just the arrows that we're going to see as sequence flows. We're going to actually have some depictions of different types of flows, and the nature of the flows, the nature of these arrows is going to be really important because that will actually dictate the nature of the flows. Also, we're going to have gateways. Gateways are one of the things that I get off on a tangent before. Gateways basically are merging and branching processes, and these usually define those decision points that I was talking about before. Okay, one of your homework assignments, I think it's chapter 2 homework assignment, will talk about a gateway decision, about what it is that you do when you get ready to come to class. All right, and at this point, you're all getting to the adult phase of adult where you're just kind of like saying, I actually check the weather. Okay, by the way, if you don't do that, if you just walk outside, march outside, heedless to any danger outside, don't do that. Okay, that was a bad idea yesterday when it was negative 11 degrees in the morning. Okay, you probably say, oh, I probably should get a coat. Yeah. So yeah, you're going to get to the point where it's like, okay, do I need an umbrella or not? And the answer is yes or no. That represents a branch. It's a gateway. If the answer is yes, grab an umbrella. If the answer is no, leave the umbrella at home. That's the simple way to interpret a gateway interpretation. It doesn't get too much more complex than that. So here's our simple examples. So we have customer presents the items, they scan and print an identification method. Then we have a gateway, okay? The cash or credit, okay? Two particular options of paying for that. If it's cash, you just accept the cash and put it in the register. It's a credit card, you have to process it. You have to have a special reader, whether that be whatever type of reader it is, but you got to process the payment in a different manner other than accepting cash. I would like to make a note here. This is a really important one. In all of the BPMN diagrams that you create, if you have a gateway, you need to have two. One should be an open gateway for the open of the decision, and the second one should be a close of the decision, okay? You will notice here, there's a diamond here that says, here's the start of the decision. Once the decision has been resolved, this closes the decision, and we move on the path. The only reason I mention this is because the book is very bad about this in later chapters about closing its gateways. And as somebody who's OCD, it drives me insane, okay? Drives me absolutely nuts. So if you really want to cause me panic and cause me commotion, don't close your gateways, okay? Actually, if you do that on the exam, it'll just be counted wrong. But if you do that in your homework, I'll just be kind of like that, yeah. So don't do that to me. I'm begging you, close your gateways. And then once that decision is made, then we're going to bag down. So very simplistic process. We got our starting and ending point. We've got our activities that are listed here. We've got a decision point that's listed and talks about two different possible decision criteria. And then we have our flows that dictate the direction for each of those. I will tell you right now, the good news is that once we get into formalized business processes, it does not get much more complex than this, okay? If you understand this simple example, you are about 75% of the way there. We will have some different scenarios, some different tweaks on this that you'll need to interpret, but this is about the level that I would expect you to be able to replicate on an exam. I'm not going to say that we're entirely there, but it's pretty close, okay? So if you're just like this, like, this is really easy, Dr. Barnes, I'm good at this, like, great, okay? Now, if you're looking at this like saying my mind has just exploded, I can't follow this, hopefully we get a little bit further there later on the semester, okay? But my guess is most of you are looking at this and say, this is intuitively sensible. Can we come to a consensus on that? Or at least not a consensus, but maybe a majority can say, yeah, I'm comfortable with this, Dr. Barnes. This is okay. This is much better than flowcharts. Yeah, all right. Now, there are a few things that we need to talk about with respect to these, because there are a few more things, a few more notes. So in this example, this example that I gave you is restricted to a single area of organization. Practice, process, and system areas overlaps. These are dictated by what's called pools and lanes. And this is actually pretty clever It's not gonna seem clever, but later on, when you think about it, you're gonna be like, okay, that's pretty insightful. So, when we talk about, different entities, or sorry, when we talk about, different, areas of organization, we're gonna actually have what we call a pool and a lane. A pool represents an entity, okay? So if we're talking about our business, like our company, that would be a single pool. And within that pool, there are different departments. And each of those departments represent a lane. Now, processes within departments will naturally overlap with one another. The area that checks credit will communicate to areas that process orders. So we'll actually have communications between departments. The way to think about this is the giant pool represents all the departments' communications with one another, and then the lanes themselves are individual departmental activities. Now, is it possible you could have multiple pools? The answer is yes. You've probably heard supply chains. There's companies that we buy from. There's customers that we sell to. Those are all separate entities. So we can work within different pools as well. So simple communication with the departments, lanes is an organization indicated by an unbroken line. So if you see a solid line, that's a communication that occurs between the departments or the lanes. If you see a dashed line, that's actually communication between organizations, between the entities themselves. And it's usually going to have a circle with an arrow on the dashed end. So here's an example of this right here. We have a doctor's office, which is one entity, and we have a patient that's another entity. We can see the communications that occur here. When a patient communicates and says, I would like an appointment with the doctor, that communication is represented by a dashed line because these are communications between two different entities, between two different pools. Now, if it's a communication between a department, excuse me, I don't mean to spit, communication between a department, then that would be something that would be dictated by a non-dash line, a solid line. It would say, okay, I'm communicating within the same pool. So that's communication there. All right. Is everybody comfortable with that? The idea of pools and lanes? Now, I know that's very simplistic, but it's a really important concept to understand because that is going to dictate how we represent the diagrams moving forward within the process areas. Now, the last parting thought is this, okay, with respect to system documentation. The bad news is they're going to continue to expand, so narrative diagrams are not going anywhere. If you hate this, sorry, okay? And regardless of your role, you're going to be able to notice how to analyze these narrative diagrams. So whatever you do in the real world, this is going to be a part of your whatever it is you do in the real world, whatever business you go into. Now the good news is, as documentation becomes more details, the tool development documentation have evolved, so we can actually use computers to do the lesson of this to a degree. I don't know if we could actually ask AI to do a BPMN diagram. That might be something kind of fun to talk about next week when we have our first AI debrief. But it would be great if AI could do UML and BPMN diagrams for us, and I think that they will be able to at some point. But the best news is, if you're one of those rare people who's sitting here talking, just kind of like, this was so cool, I can't wait for UML diagrams, you have got a bright career ahead of you. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you all on Friday.
You going?
But I like a lot of the flow chart.
So much.